I start with a more receptive tone, my counterpart mimics it. Now that they're more receptive, I'm more receptive. And the whole conversation is sort of less likely to result in, a fight and name calling and, all the things we try to avoid.
That's Julia Minson talking about one of several key findings from her extensive research on receptiveness. Receptiveness is mimicked. Through specific communication strategies identified by artificial intelligence, we can create an openness in others to meaningfully engage and consider our point of view, even if it strongly opposes their own. Julie is an associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She's a social psychologist with research interests in conflict, negotiations, and judgment and decision-making. Her primary line of research addresses the psychology of disagreement. How do people engage with opinions, judgments, and decisions that are different from their own? She explores this theme in the context of group decision-making to uncover the psychological biases that prevent managers, consumers, and policymakers from maximizing the benefits of collaboration. She also studies the conditions that make people willing to listen and be receptive to views and opinions they strongly oppose on political and social topics. Prior to the Harvard Kennedy School, Julia served as a lecturer at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, where she taught negotiations at both the MBA and the undergraduate levels. She received her PhD in social psychology from Stanford University and her BA in psychology from Harvard. I'm Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, we dig into the science of receptiveness. Topics discussed include what receptiveness is and why it's so important, whether liberals are more receptive than conservatives, how age influences our openness to the opinions of others, the link between receptiveness and good decision-making, the linguistic markers that convey receptiveness, the power of acknowledgement, how mediators can frame discussions to promote receptiveness, why being formal and polite in argument can be counterproductive, the key to creating receptiveness at the Braver Angels workshops, how you can test your own level of receptiveness, and much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Warren. Thanks very much for having me.
In the introduction, I briefly outlined your professional experience, but in your own words, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started doing conflict work back at Stanford when I was a PhD student under the tutelage of Lee Ross, who was sort of one of the great social psychologists of his time. I live in Lexington, Mass, with my husband and 3 daughters, and a pit bull named Jinx. And they sort of challenge my conflict resolution negotiation skills on a daily basis. There's nothing like having teenage girls to make you think long and hard about your choice of words.
Right. Challenge for sure. And you have some tools, though, from your work that would help with that, which I want to dig into, starting with your work on receptiveness. Has receptiveness been a recent focus of yours? How long have you been working on that specific topic?
So it's a funny thing. I've been studying receptiveness for a long time. I actually started doing this type of work as a graduate student at Stanford. At that time, I had a classmate, Francis Chen, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia. And so Francis and I started, thinking about how can people have productive, thoughtful, sort of really engaged conversations in situations where they might never really reach agreement, sort of spaces where compromise or kind of attitude change are really off the table, but people still need to be able to work together and need to be able to converse productively. And at the time, sort of the paradigmatic example of that was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And, fast forward, of course, by, 15 years, and we're in a situation where lots of people all around the world, including in the United States, can't have productive conversations with their friends and neighbors. And so all of a sudden this work has, just really sort of taken off and getting a lot more attention, getting applied a lot more, because it's now very relevant right here at home.
Uh-huh. It certainly is. Maybe we should start with defining it then specifically. How do you define receptiveness?
Yeah, so we think about receptiveness in terms of sort of the processes that have to happen in order for somebody to really engage with an opposing perspective. And we draw from research in cognitive psychology to say that receptiveness is really the willingness to access information, consider information, and evaluate information from your own side and the opposing side in sort of a relatively impartial manner, right? So it's really about, were you kind of around to hear this argument? Did you think hard about this argument? And did you evaluate it using the same standard of evidence as you would have used for an argument from your own side of the aisle? Right. And what's, I think really interesting, we thought very, very long and hard about that definition. What I think is always important to point out is that if you notice, nowhere in the definition do we talk about compromise. So, receptiveness is really about listening to somebody and thinking hard about what they're saying. It's not, it doesn't require you to change your opinion and kind of meet them in the middle,
right?
As long as you have considered it carefully and then decided that, my point of view is still better, and here's sort of all the reasons why that might be the case.
Really important. So to access, consider, evaluate, but not necessarily agree. I don't think people come about this very naturally from just anecdotally. But you have measured this. If I understand, you began with developing a questionnaire, maybe not began because this goes back so far for you, but you developed a questionnaire to quantify the amount of receptiveness that people engage in. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So one of the things, when we first started out, right, we were like young, enthusiastic, fairly naive graduate students. And we thought, what we're going to do is we're going to increase receptiveness in the world. So the first thing we did was try to run studies to increase receptiveness. And all of our ideas, some of them failed outright, right? Some of them did absolutely nothing. And then some of them kind of impacted some measures that we were thinking were related to receptiveness and didn't impact other measures. And then eventually we sat down and we thought, well, what exactly are we measuring and what is receptiveness? Right. And I remember very clearly, Francis came to visit me at Harvard. At this point, we were both faculty, and we spent hours in my office debating what we think receptiveness is. And we'd have, sort of these conversations about like, well, if you listen to somebody, but the whole time you're listening, you're counter arguing what they're saying in your head. Is that receptiveness? Well, that doesn't sound like receptiveness, right? Or what if you listen very, very carefully and you thought really, really hard about it, but the only reason you are listening and paying attention is because you want to make an opposing speech, right? And you're sort of looking for flaws in their argument. Is that receptiveness? No, that doesn't sound like receptiveness either. And so, we realized that there were a lot of ways of thinking about what this thing is that were all somewhat incomplete. And so that's how we came up with the definition. And once we had the definition and we wanted, once again, to run experiments to increase it, we thought, well, we need to be able to measure this thing, right? Before we sort of test interventions to, create more receptiveness, how do we know that we're doing it if we don't know how it's measured? And so we thought, well, let's come up with a scale. And then that took another 5 years.
Okay.
So we have a scale. It's 18 questions, 18 multiple choice questions. It takes about 5 minutes to administer. And for those of your listeners who are interested in learning about their own receptiveness, we have a website called receptiveness.net. Very easy to find. And so if you go to receptiveness.net, you can actually take the quiz.
Oh, great.
One of the things that, we wanted to do was also give people some sense of sort of, what does the number mean, right? So you get a score on a 1 to 7 scale, but what does it mean to be a 4.3, right? So the way the website works is we collect the data from anybody who takes the quiz, and then we can show you where your score is relative to other people who've taken it, right? And so it could be just people overall, or you can say, what's my score relative to other women, or, what's my score relative to other liberals, or, what's my score relative to like other people with PhDs. So it's a fun exercise. And then you can sort of print it out and stare at it and tell your spouse that you're extremely receptive.
Yeah, right. That sounds really interesting, especially comparing across groups. Do you know offhand what the average is just across the board, or is that something you've looked at? Or
across the board, it tends to land around 4.5, because that's sort of the midpoint of the scale. Okay. What we tend to see in terms of patterns is interesting, because I do a lot of research on political disagreement, and receptiveness has sort of a particular politicized flavor in a sense, right? Because part of the kind of liberal ideology, right, is that we're sort of a big tent that's open to everybody's ideas. So liberals often say, well, have you given receptiveness to conservatives, and isn't it true that they're less receptive than us? And that's not the case. So it's sort of a strength of the measure that it doesn't show a party bias. It also doesn't show a gender bias. So men and women tend to be roughly of similar levels on receptiveness. And then the one thing that we do see is that as people get older, they become less receptive, which you can sort of, fits with our ideas of kind of getting more set in your beliefs, and not necessarily wanting to sort of think long and hard about things you disagree with.
That's really interesting. So becoming fixed in our beliefs, which presumably happens as we age, decreases receptiveness. Okay, so what are the risks here? Why is it important to have receptiveness as a personal quality?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I would say, the number one reason why it's important is because if you're going to function in the world and make good decisions about sort of your life and good decisions in the workplace, if you're going to vote and try to influence the direction of your country, right, you need to know both sides of any given argument. And economists, would think that it's like completely and patently obvious that information is a good thing, right? And so to the extent that I'm well familiar with information on my side of any given story, I should be working hard to get information on the other side, because that's new information, right? So new information is sort of more valuable than information I already have at my disposal. So there is sort of a strong rational argument to be made for being more receptive in order to be able to make better decisions based on the full suite of information, not just the things you like because the people on your side of the argument are saying them.
Yeah.
And that's really what we find, is that people who are more receptive are more willing to consume information on both sides, and they evaluate it more rationally, and they have sort of an easier time paying attention to arguments. I mean, people are remarkably good at filtering out what they don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Right? We've been enabled to do it by the rise of social media, right? Where it's not only, sort of back in the day, right? You used to have to sort of subscribe to publications that you like and avoid the ones you don't like, right? Now, the social media platforms just feed you what they assume you like based on your zip code.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So you don't even have to make an active choice anymore to avoid disagreeable information. It's sort of made for you. Which means that if you want to be a well-informed human being, you have to work harder to, really seek out the stuff on the other side. So I would say that is really sort of the number one thing. But, there's this sort of other piece of it, which is probably very close to your heart as a mediator and a conflict resolution professional, is the way receptiveness plays out in conflict. And I think that's really, that's really interesting. And one of the things we've started doing is really thinking about, this is sort of the narrative about how the research progressed. We started with the scale, and then we thought, okay, well, now we have this easy, reliable, well-validated way of sorting people who are more or less receptive. But does it really make a difference when they interact with somebody they disagree with? In other words, they're more willing to read, newspapers from the opposing political party, but in conflict, can the opponent tell that they're talking to somebody who's more versus less receptive, right?
Right.
In some ways, that's a much harder thing to study, because what you need to do then is you need to find people who disagree about something that's kind of near and dear to them. Then you need to bring them together in the lab, and then you need to get them to argue about it while filling out questionnaires. So logistically, it's kind of a nightmare.
Uh-huh.
But, this is where the internet helps, right? Because we can have, we can reach hundreds of thousands of research participants, and we can connect them. We can connect them virtually instead of actually having to bring them to Cambridge and put them in a physical lab. But one of the things we've found through sort of doing this type of work is that, people really can't tell if you're receptive in your head or not. This is the tricky part. So in other words, I can be super receptive, and I think I'm working really, really hard to understand what you're saying and where you're coming from, and the reasoning behind your arguments. And when you evaluate me, you're like, nah, she wasn't listening that well. I don't know what she was thinking about. I don't think she was thinking about, what I was saying.
Right.
And so there's this big disconnect between how receptive people feel that they're being versus how receptive their counterparts see them as being. Which we found really surprising, which then led to this question of okay, well, what do you have to do in order to have people see you as receptive?
Yeah.
Right. If let's assume for a second that people are generally sort of well-meaning, and they want to have nice conversations, and they want to have polite interactions, and they really want to understand why their fellow humans believe certain things, right? Let's assume for a second that we're all Canadians, right? How do we show that you have that, that good nature and that willingness? How do you communicate it in conflict? Mm-hmm. And so that led to another kind of multi-year project, which was using natural language processing to look at transcripts of hundreds of conversations where people were debating something, near and dear to their heart, and saying, what can people say? What words and phrases can they use that are correlated with the evaluations that their counterparts give them, right? In other words, what are the little signals of receptiveness that I can send that people recognize as receptiveness? Mm-hmm. Because we figured out that, what's happening in my head is not a recognizable signal to my conflict counterparts. And so we developed a natural language processing algorithm and fed hundreds, now thousands of conversations into it, and have identified kind of a specific list of what we call linguistic markers, right? Linguistic markers is basically just a term for words and phrases that make people feel like their counterpart is really, truly engaging with their point of view.
Right. So it makes the other feel that they're receptive. So again, just to recap, to make sure I follow.
Yep.
The disconnect is that there's a low correlation between self-rated receptiveness versus partner-rated receptiveness. So I can think I'm being receptive, in my own head, but the other won't see me this way, and it doesn't get translated that way, and there's this disconnect, which and again, returning to conflict, which would be I see how that could even escalate things. I'm thinking I'm being as open as possible, and the other actually doesn't see me being like that at all. So the AI looked for expressions, linguistic markers that would increase or be an indication of receptiveness to the other. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Interesting.
That's
So
exactly
yeah,
right.
what'd you find then?
Well, so, we found some things that, kind of in retrospect, you're like, yeah, this definitely makes sense, right? And I think a lot of folks who are listening to your podcast who are in the sort of conflict mediation space themselves would be like, yeah, this sounds familiar. So one of the most important markers of receptiveness we found is something we're calling acknowledgement, which is basically using your own airtime to repeat and restate and acknowledge what your counterpart just said, right? So it's a lot of phrases that start with, you said that, blah, 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 or it sounds like XYZ, right? I just heard you say that something is important to you, which I think is interesting, right? Because if you think about any kind of argument, there's always this sense of time being limited, right? Like, this person just said this crazy thing, and I better counter argue against them as quickly as possible so that this crazy thing they said doesn't keep like hovering in the air, right? It's like I need to swat it down as quickly as I can with my best argument. And acknowledgement is the opposite. Acknowledgement is taking a beat and saying, okay, I understand that you said XYZ. Is that right? Yeah. Right. And then following up with what your own sort of rebuttal might be. And the thing that's really interesting about it, right, is that in order to do acknowledgement effectively, there's absolutely no way to do it without actually having heard the person. Right? Like, in order to restate somebody's point, you have to have thought about it. And so it is an incredibly robust signal of the fact that I was actually listening to you, as opposed to sort of, people love bringing up like nonverbal signals, right? But nonverbal signals are very easy to fake. Yeah. Acknowledgement is hard to fake because I have to actually use my own words to show that I listen. Yeah.
And I can't just say, I hear you. I have to say, I hear that. You have to restate what you heard. And that's really interesting. I mean, acknowledgement, we talk about this a lot, and how it relates to de-escalation, reconciliation. And we talk about also acknowledging not only what they said, but their feeling, right? Their emotional state as well, as another powerful. It's really neat that you found evidence, that's a powerful one, or the AI, I guess.
Yeah.
Found
it.
Right. How neat is that? What? Okay, so that's one, acknowledgement.
Yep. Another one that I think, people find a little bit surprising, and I often get pushback on it, is finding areas of agreement.
Okay.
And the idea is that, you and I can disagree. For example, right now in the States, of course, we have the Omicron wave, and there's a lot of debate about schools remaining open or closing, right? Mm-hmm. And so imagine we're in this hot argument about whether schools should open or close. But where we disagree on that particular topic, we might agree on a lot of other things. Right. And so finding and naming those places where we agree is another signal of receptiveness. So something like, I agree that it's been a really difficult 2 years, or I agree that we both want what's best for our kids, or I agree that in-person education has a lot of benefits. Mm-hmm. And so it's a way of finding, kind of signaling common ground without actually compromising on the thing that you're debating about.
Right.
But just saying, look, we share these certain values. And again, I listened to you long enough to identify what are these values that you might have that I also share? And a lot of people hear the word agreement and they interpret it as compromise or as giving up on something that's dear to you. But this is really, kind of agreement about the broader values or sort of other aspects of the situation, right? Not necessarily meeting in the middle.
I wouldn't give pushback on that. I think that makes sense to find areas that are agreeable, but does that word have to be used? Did the AI find other linguistic markers that so do you have to use the terminology each time? I agree with, is there other ways we can put that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the kind of the thing about, right, the AI is that it basically searches for and then allows us to kind of refine a list of phrases that are all different ways of signaling the same concept.
Right.
So, even words like sort of also, right? Like the AI would pick that up. I also think, right? Or similarly, something, right? So you don't have to actually use the word agree.
Okay, so it's that broad category of agreeing with something. Wait,
yeah.
I got you. Okay.
Yep.
Acknowledgement, agreement.
Yep.
What else?
The other one, so the other big one is hedging.
Hedging.
And recently, we keep refining the algorithm sort of related to hedging is, maybe it's something that really marriage therapists have been talking about forever, is expressing opinions as subjective, right? So instead of saying kids' lives are going to be irreparably damaged by not having in-person education, you say something like, sometimes I think it can be very damaging to not have in-person education.
Okay.
Right. So sometimes is a hedge, and I think is subjectivity.
Gotcha.
And it's basically saying, look, it's humility, right? It's basically saying, I don't know everything about everything, but here is my unique perspective.
Yeah, a less aggressive, less direct approach. That makes sense too, right? I mean,
exactly. And then the final one that really sort of predicts a lot of variance in the data is using more positive versus negative phrases. Using sort of more positive emotion words. Instead of saying, I hate it when people interrupt me, you could say, I love it when people let me finish my thought.
Right.
So the same exact message, right? The message is, please don't interrupt me, but phrased in a positive way instead of a negative way.
Yeah.
So the algorithm, comes out with like 30 different markers, but the four that I just talked you through are the ones that do a lot of the work, right? They do a lot of the work in making somebody come across as more receptive. And so we have really focused a lot of our training research then on saying, can we train people to do these four things? Because that's, the beauty of it, right, is that the four things are pretty simple. So we're really hoping that sort of like the simplicity of it can make it easier for folks to come up with the right words in the heat of the moment.
Right. It sounds like your work is confirming sort of the principles of active listening. In a sense, a lot of those are similar tools, but you're also finding specific phrases that people can draw upon just to make the process easier. And I mean, for a mediator, they would, part of their job would be like creating receptiveness in the parties, restating what they say and reframing how they say it, but they could use these terms. Are the linguistic markers, like the actual terms, are they available on the receptiveness.net site, or can people have access to that at all? Or I mean, it'd be a handy little list, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So on receptiveness.net, there's a few things depending on like how much of a nerd you are. So one, all the academic papers are available, and we are big proponents of what's these days called open science, which means that we post all of our data and all of our analysis code publicly. So for like the academics out there, we really try to help the next generation of scholars take our work, replicate it, extend it, all the
Great.
data are there. For sort of the teachers and the practitioners out there, one of the other features of the website is that there's like a little training writing portal
Okay.
where you can literally go and write a message to somebody you disagree with. And the algorithm is running behind the scenes, and it will give you a score on how receptive your message is.
Wow.
And all the markers that I mentioned are written up on the website in that section.
Wonderful.
Where you sort of like it won't edit it for you in real time, but you can look and see, sort of it'll remind you about acknowledgement and agreement. And one of the newer things we've been doing, so I work at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and of course we every year bring in hundreds of students from all over the world who are coming to get their graduate degrees in public policy and public management. And a large part of that education is talking to people who, you might strongly disagree with about, the policies that their country is enacting, right? Or, the way that their part of the world relates to your part of the world. So one of the things we've started doing this year is actually training conversational receptiveness, using conversational receptiveness training as part of our student orientation.
Oh.
For that, we came up with a little acronym, which helps people remember these things. And the acronym is I hear you. And so the word hear, right, stands for hedging, emphasizing agreement, acknowledgement, and reframing to the positive. And so we have literally been, creating sort of printouts and stickers and bookmarks to like have these examples ready at the fingertips for students, so that again, if they're in a difficult conversation that requires some receptiveness, they don't have to like think hard about it. It's just right there on a sticker that's stuck to their laptop.
Yeah. It's so important, really, the way the brain shuts down too during those moments when emotions are high and whatnot, and to have those critical linguistic markers to rely on to create that receptiveness is important. It's great. I think it's a great study or great focus of work. And I find it interesting how it sort of captures a lot of the stuff that mediators try to do and the stuff we teach. And this is coming through. What's the volume of studies the AI, or the volume of discussions and arguments that the AI actually went through to produce these outputs?
So probably the initial study had maybe, 500-700 conversations in it. Right. And then with each additional data set, we sort of, add to it and refine it. One of the things that, is beautiful about AI, of course, is that it's by far faster and cheaper than human research assistants, right? So, for example, we have one data set based on an online political science course. So this is one of those, massively open online courses that enrolls like tens of thousands of people from all over the world. And one of the assignments in the course is that every week the professor posts sort of a controversial topic, and the students have to write kind of an opinion, right, in response to this policy topic. And it's kind of a rolling student chat, so that other students reply to the first person, and it creates this like long thread where, you might have dozens or hundreds of people responding, right? And so we have taken the data from these online threads. And so at this point, you can imagine it's sort of a huge amount of data, right? Mm-hmm. And we can feed it through the AI. And one of the things that it shows is that the receptiveness the conversational receptiveness, the linguistic markers of the first person who wrote the first comment is basically correlated with the level of receptiveness for the remainder of the conversation. So people mimic the level of receptiveness of the first person, and it like propagates itself in sort of a spiral, right? Where if the first person is really confrontational, then it becomes a conflict spiral. And so that's kind of the beautiful thing about the AI is that we can take like hefty amounts of data and feed it through in a reasonable amount of time to get answers, quickly.
That's an interesting finding as well. So, and if someone starts with a more receptive tone, it will be met with that as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea, and that's sort of the next big project we're working on. We have through a number of studies where we can show that receptiveness is reciprocated, right? So if I start exactly what you said, if I start with a more receptive tone, my counterpart mimics it. Now that they're more receptive, I'm more receptive, and the whole conversation is sort of less likely to result in, a fight and name calling and, all the things we try to avoid.
Gotcha.
Which, I think what you mentioned something interesting a few minutes ago about the role of the mediator as creating receptiveness by using some of these tools that they, of course, are trained in. And it made me think about how we've never considered the role of third parties in creating a receptive atmosphere. So we're always thinking about, you have, the two parties in the conflict. Can we make one party sound receptive so that it sort of, affects the other party?
Yeah.
But of course, if there's a trained person in the room, that might all work much better.
Yeah. That's part of the job, right? Reframing it in more positive and neutral language. And they're essentially receptiveness creators.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I'm now thinking about, how can you run experiments on that?
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I want to return to something as well. Just that concept of someone thinking they're being receptive and open. Like if I try to be open and listen, you would think the other would feel that, they would, capture that. But your studies suggest that they don't. Why, when someone tries to be, do you have any idea why someone, when they try to be receptive, that it's not translated that way? What are they doing exactly that's not being translated when they're purposely trying, right?
Right. I think there's two big pieces to it. One is, I think there's a big difference between like a lay person who has good intentions versus a trained professional, right? In the sense that, if I go into an argument with my husband, right, and I go in with sort of good intentions of I'm going to listen and I'm going to really try, maybe I'll last like 5 minutes, right? And then at some point, what I really want is to get my point across. And I think that's very different than when I do consulting work and I go in with my professional hat. And then it's really sort of like, this is not my time to express my opinion. As a professional, I can have like almost infinite patience.
Yeah.
But when it's my conflict, I think our good intentions kind of fall apart pretty quickly. And this whole thing of saying that, sort of do active listening and really try to give the person space and, really engage with their perspective. It's just, I think, much, much easier said than done. Like when we watch people who do it well, it seems very easy. But when you have to do it yourself and your emotions are, aroused, and when you're angry and when you are frustrated and you have all these good arguments that you want to share, I think it's just much harder than it looks.
Right.
I think that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is that what people, when they're doing their best, what they often do wrong is they replace engagement with formality. Right. So we often think of being polite as sort of the right way to avoid conflict. And so what we see a lot, when we read the transcripts of the people who rated themselves as receptive, but whose partners did not rate them as receptive, we see a lot of things like, calling the other person sir, right? Like, you, sir, are wrong about this. Right? So it's polite and it's formal, but it doesn't feel like you really sort of like crossed any kind of intellectual divide and really engaged with my point of view. Right. And so that's kind of the other mistake is, sometimes acknowledgement and agreement, like it doesn't have to be formal and it almost doesn't even have to be polite, right? Sometimes you can hear curse words in very receptive conversations, right? Mm-hmm. But that's, I think, the mistake people make is they have like the wrong intuition about what sounds receptive.
Mm-hmm. So being too formal is one where that's a clear backfire when someone's trying to be receptive.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That's exactly right.
Do you have any other suggestions on how people can increase their receptiveness?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I found really kind of interesting and surprising in doing this type of work is really kind of recognizing how much of receptiveness is not about what's going on in your own head, but actually about the environment or the conversation that you create with your counterpart. Right. So I went in thinking that, some people are more receptive and some people are less receptive, and we got to make the less receptive people be more receptive.
Right.
And now I've started thinking about it in terms of receptiveness almost being more like a property of the conversation instead of a property of the individuals in the conversation.
Oh, interesting.
And that started coming out of the work on receptiveness being reciprocated and mimicked. And then recently I have a new paper with two graduate students of mine, Hannah Collins and Charlie Dorison, and a colleague at Harvard Business School, Francesca Gino. And Hannah is a Canadian in good standing from Vancouver Island. So she's going to be very pleased to have her work mentioned on a Canadian podcast.
Right on.
So we started out working with an organization called Braver Angels. And it's an American nonprofit organization that brings together liberals and conservatives. And they have what they call red blue workshops. And so it's this, half a day long thing or a day long thing where they bring together equal numbers of liberals and conservatives, and they put them through a set of exercises where they're very explicitly like forbidden from trying to persuade the other side of any policy position. And the whole workshop is geared at learning about the other side. Really like learning and understanding the other person's point of view. And we thought, maybe this is like the magic. Maybe the magic is we need to get everybody to want to learn about the other person's point of view. And if everybody's in this, learning mindset, then, partisan conflict is solved. And so we ran a bunch of studies where we kept telling people that they need to take on a learning mindset. And they just like all failed one after the other. And, we literally couldn't figure out what we were doing wrong until we thought harder about the Braver Angels approach and realized that they're telling the whole room to have a learning mindset.
Okay.
Right. So it's not like, Julia, you should try harder to, learn from Warren. It's, Julia, you and Warren together are going to learn about each other.
Interesting.
And what that led us to sort of recognize, and now we have the data to support it, is that people seem to be walking around with the impression that they are learning plenty about their counterparts. It's that their counterparts are not doing enough. So you can tell me that I should try harder to learn about you like all day long, but I think I'm already doing it. And so I'm not going to change anything about my behavior because I think that I'm already doing my part, But when somebody tells me, Julia, Warren here is really interested in learning about your perspective, that changes my beliefs about you. Because my standing assumption about people on the other side of a conflict is that, one, they're not too bright, and two, they're not very caring. Right. And so once you tell me that this other person wants to learn about me, that kind of elevates my assumptions about both their intelligence and their willingness to be empathetic, right? And so we ran a number of studies where we basically, say, here's a topic on which you told us, you hold opinion X. Here's another person who holds opinion Y. By the way, this person is going, wants to learn about your perspective. Mm-hmm. And then this other person, they're not entirely a fictional person. We had people with those opinions who described their opinion, right? But we can sort of show participants the exact same, paragraph about here's why I believe what I believe. And they interpret that same text and those same arguments more favorably when it comes from a person who they think also wants to learn about them.
So a subtle distinction there of encouraging someone to learn about the other versus having them understand that the other is interested in learning about them. And I guess this is another tip a third party could take away, right? That's something they could easily implement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the third party here, right, has a really important role in terms of kind of setting the norms for the conversation.
Right.
We are here for this purpose, and both of us, both the participants or both the parties now share this common, set of instructions and common goal. So I think that's another thing that third parties can absolutely do. And then the kind of follow-up studies we're doing now is, okay, if there is no third party, how do you express that, right? What do you have to say? And this is a little bit back connected to conversational receptiveness, right?
Yeah.
What do you have to say so that the message is strong enough and clear enough that the other party really believes that you want to understand where they're coming from?
Well, I'm really interested in hearing what you find out about that. And I know you have to go, so we'll wrap up here. But thanks very much for explaining your work on receptiveness. It's interesting stuff. The importance of hearing and evaluating others' views, as well as being heard, right, to convey receptiveness to others so that it's reciprocated, especially in negotiations and conflict situations, is pretty critical. And I think it's great that through your research, you're able to hone in on these specific markers, the exact, the terminology that people can rely on to effectively achieve that. So it's good stuff. And thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Warren. This was really, really enjoyable.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cian.org. That's CIIAN.org.